Hey folks, it's Janek Gwizdala. It's the Janek Gwizdala podcast, special interview episode today with one of my heroes. It never gets old interviewing your heroes, and this one happens to also be a great friend and the band leader of Vital Information, a band which I am now a member of, a band which is celebrating 40 years of existence. We were in the studio about 6 or 7 months ago in New York recording a new double album, which is out now. Everything is linked below, including the tour dates to our upcoming East Coast portion of the 40th anniversary tour. We start out June 17th out in Long Island, and we finish up the run with 3 nights at Birdland in Manhattan in New York City, June 30th, July 1st, July 2nd. Again, all tour dates are linked below. This interview was taped back in April as we closed out our West Coast tour in Phoenix, Arizona at the Musical Instrument Museum. I wish it was 5 times longer. I have 5,000 more questions that I wanted to ask Steve. Unfortunately, our schedule was really tight, and this was all the time we had to sit down and chat. The interview was super fun for me, as Steve has been a hero for many years. He was in Steps Ahead, the 1986 concert in Tokyo that was a huge part of the motivation for me moving to the US and to become a professional musician, period. So I'll stop my yakking. We'll get into it. I hope it's the first of many times we get to sit down and talk about music. This is my interview with the great Steve Smith. Last night of the tour, last night of the West Coast tour. Amazing. 10 shows. How do you feel, first of all? I've wanted to ask you this the whole tour, and I've waited until we sat down.
Okay.
Like, how do you feel physically after hitting 10 days in a row? Pretty much 10 days.
Yeah,
a couple of days
it's a challenge for me at this age to. It's not the playing. It's the setting it up. It's the breakdown.
Right.
It's not quite enough sleep at night. That's the challenge that I'm faced with now at 68 years old.
Right.
And then we have these long drives, and what makes it worth it, of course, is that 90 minutes or 75 minutes on stage.
Right.
And then, we have a fantastic time. And then after the gig, it's nice. Then you get the glow, the afterglow. But yeah, the setup, the tear down, that's a challenge.
I mean, you're not traveling with the smallest amount of gear or the largest amount of road crew.
Right.
It's like, what a combination.
Yeah, it's working out. We have Nick on tour with us, who does the driving, he does the sound, and he helps with the setup and breakdown. But I also try to call in a favor or two, like if I have a friend in the area, come on in, hang out, we'll work on the drums, and that works out too. Now,
something I didn't know was that you play with Ahmed Jamal. That's news to me. I thought I knew a lot about your career.
Yeah.
And then you pulled out these Ahmed Jamal charts that they sent you.
Right.
Beautiful handwritten charts.
Gorgeous charts.
What year was that?
That would have been 87, I think. It was right around the time of Steps Ahead, when I was first playing with Steps Ahead. And the connection is Milan Simic.
Okay.
So Milan Simic, not at that time, I don't think in those years he was managing Steps, but he went on to be Steps Ahead manager. And Milan Simic is a New York impresario who is a producer, and he organizes gigs, and he calls me for many of those gigs. And somehow he saw me play with Steps Ahead at the Bottom Line in 86.
Okay.
And liked my playing and recommended me to Ahmad, which led to a call when they needed a drummer.
Okay. So that's kind of an amazing, like, opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the 1986 concert. For those people who don't know, anyone who follows the podcast, you're going to know this. That's one of the 2 things that made me move to America, was seeing the Steps Ahead live in Tokyo in 1986 and seeing Brecker Brothers, Return of the Brecker Brothers tour. Those were the 2 things. I've since gone on to play with everyone from all of those albums, which is amazing. But as I think about how I experienced that, I wasn't listening to Ahmed Jamal at the same time.
Right.
Yet you were like doing this.
Actually, I wasn't either. But I learned about Ahmad's music by playing with him and right before playing with him. But I've since listened and studied his music.
But it's way more kind of intimate.
It was a trio and at times a percussionist.
Okay.
And so it was Jimmy Kamak on bass and Ahmad and myself, and then like a conga player at times. Yeah, and it was volume level was low,
Right.
very low. And the first week was a week at Catalina, the old Catalina. And that's how I met the folks at Catalina that got my
Gotcha.
foot in the door, then to go back with Vital Information.
Wow. So all the way back then in '87, you were
Yeah.
sort of laying the groundwork
That's right.
for touring as a band leader.
Yeah, I mean, like as I toured with various bands, I got to know the clubs and got to
Right.
know the bookers or the owners. And then one thing leads to another. And then I would, it's like, I got a band,
Right.
can we play here? Basically, and then eventually, I started to do the touring
Yeah.
with my own group.
So, like the what were you coming off? I've always wanted to ask you this. What were you coming off just before the Steps Ahead thing? Was that the end of Journey right
Yeah.
before that?
Yes.
I'm just trying to get the transition of
so
like...
my first time of getting fired from Journey was 1985.
Okay.
Ross Valerie and I, and that's it's a long story that's been told time and time again.
I'm just interested in the timeline, like musically where you were coming from. So
that was in July 1985, and so I spent some time at home. And at that time, that was really hard for me emotionally. It was quite painful.
Okay.
Because I was so very invested in the band.
Right.
Like I was a full-time band member.
Sure.
That's all I did for like 7 years.
Right.
Like not all I did, but it was like not kind of a 9-to-5 all-encompassing
with
job.
Vital Information kind of sprinkled in.
Yeah, and then
it.
when I had time off, I do Vital Information. I also was doing the Tom Coster group.
Okay.
And that was with Randy Jackson on bass and Joaquim Lievino on guitar and Tom Coster. And we played not a lot of gigs, but we had some fun. And in fact, I introduced Randy to the guys.
I was going to say, is that how he got the gig?
Yeah, because he and I were playing with Tom, but we also were a rhythm section that was getting gigs at Fantasy Records as session guys.
Okay.
We just go in and play on various albums. And one of the things that happened after being out of Journey is there were many requests for me to do drum clinics from Sonar and Zildjian, and I hadn't really been able to do many clinics because my schedule was so busy.
Right.
And so then in '86, I went did a lot of clinics for Sonar and Zildjian and Remo and the other companies, but mainly spearheaded by Sonar or Zildjian. And then there was one clinic I did in the Philadelphia area with Peter Erskine and with Lenny White, Kenwood Denard, Jerry Brown. It was a great gathering of the different drummers, and that's when backstage I was hanging out with Peter and Lenny. And Peter, who I had known since 1974,
Right.
1973.
Stan Kenton.
Yeah, Stan Kenton camp.
Right.
Even before that, I'd see him on the road as the drummer with Stan Kenton,
Right.
and he totally blew me away because here was this kid my age,
Right.
killing it.
You guys are only a few months apart, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So he told me that he had just left Steps Ahead, and I was like, oh, really? Because he was going to play with Joe Zawinul
Right.
Syndicate. And Lenny said, oh, yeah, I know. They called me to do it, but I can't make it. And it's like, I need a gig. and Lenny said, I'll call Mike Maneri and Mike Brecker. I said, that'd be great.
Boom.
And how many times do you hear that and then nothing ever happens?
Every time,
Yeah.
right?
But literally the next day I was doing a clinic at a music store in Washington, D.C., and somehow they found me, and the store manager came up and he goes, I got Mike Brecker on the phone for you.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so I went and talked to Michael Brecker, and then a little while later Mike Maneri called, and they said, when your clinic tour's over, come to New York, and we want to start rehearsing.
Damn.
And that was it.
Because it's like the few stories you've told in the van, and it's just been around you for many years now, there's been this sort of recurring theme that things have happened quite quickly.
Quickly, yeah.
There's been this like very few links in the chain before the initial idea to the actual thing happening.
That's true.
Like, yeah.
I've been very lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah, very fortuitous with, all these
But also being around Pete that long as well has always kind of fascinated me. As you well know, I just interviewed Peter. He, of course, talked about you a little bit, but you guys are kind of close. And
yes.
You've talked about like learning some of his parts, for instance, from Magnetic before the Steps Ahead tour.
Yeah, I really studied the parts that he played. And it was that album, Magnetic.
Which they did in 85, I think, right? Shortly before the tour,
Yeah. And, I transcribed them. I think I have it with me. I have it wasn't on that record, but Pools. Because then we played Pools, so I had to learn Pools, which, some of those parts are so specific and unique and interesting.
Yeah.
And so you don't just like play them like a jazz tune. They're orchestrated as one would do a rock tune, really, in a way. Like very much like the bass line and the drum part and the chords and all of it is like pieces of a puzzle that fit together.
Which is interesting because when I hear you play with Journey, for instance, it is very orchestrated what you do.
Yeah.
Like the parts, you didn't just go in there and go bashing away,
Right.
It is very orchestrated. And was that something that attracted you to like the Steps Ahead kind of thing? Were you? Is that something you identified with, or
I don't think so. I just Steps Ahead. Well, ever since they came out, it attracted me because they're great virtuosos, great musicians,
Sure.
love the music. So ever since I heard "Smokin' in the Pit," I think that was the early record, and the ones with Steve Gadd, and then the early records with Peter, I just was a huge fan. And I loved all those musicians individually and then collectively. The sound they made together.
So you've done just about every gig there is, give or take a couple. Is there anyone you have been a huge fan of that you always thought, oh man, I would have loved to have done this or done that?
Yeah, I would love to play with Herbie Hancock.
Okay.
And I played with him. It's for like one song on a TV show where actually it's like a midnight special or something where he sat in with Journey on a synth,
Oh, wow.
Well, I know, it's like in those days, like, and I don't remember whether it was Don Kirshner's rock concert or, it was one of those shows, but we were doing gigs. I think Alphonse Mouzon was playing with Herbie.
Okay.
And we were hanging out and he just came over and played some synth with us. So, but that
would be one.
Yeah.
And it's fun. I mean, for me, playing in Vital Information, obviously, I listened to your band as a teenager. We're playing Perfect Date. That was always one of my favorite tunes.
Right.
Now Manuel has kind of wound up the crazy meter on that.
Yeah.
Like Un
we
Poco
have the
Loco.
2023 version of
exactly. But we're playing a lot of jazz as well.
Yeah.
Like, has that always been the underlying thing? Was that the initial sort of embryo to start it all off? Or was it like the Beatles or something? You know what I mean? Like,
to start my interest in music?
Yeah, just when you were really young. Has that always been an underlying thing? Because you've done all this rock stuff and fusion stuff and stuff that really isn't so related to, Max Roach or, playing with brushes even. Like,
yeah, I think when I go back to my music orientation, it takes me back to starting out drumming at 9 years old with a teacher. So I wanted to play the drums, and then my parents brought me to a private teacher, which was a great way to start.
Yeah.
And so actually from the first note of picking up a stick and then opening a book that's like, this is a quarter note, and this is a quarter rest, and this R means the right hand, and this L means the left hand, and traditional. It was like pretty traditional in that way, but my teacher, Billy Flanagan, and he lived in Brockton, Mass., which is just south of Boston, and actually really close to where the Zildjian factory is. He kind of fostered that love of jazz in me, and he was into Buddy Rich and Louis Bellson and Joe Morello, and my parents did have some jazz records like Benny Goodman records with Gene Krupa. Okay. So I liked jazz, and I liked big band. That was the main kind of music that I liked.
Right.
And then luckily I got to see a lot of those big bands.
Did you know Buddy Rich, or did you hang with him at all? Or?
I met him once.
Okay. Intimidating
there's
fellow?
a picture.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of funny, but totally intimidating. And I saw him for the first time in 1968 when he was playing at the Boston Globe Jazz Festival.
Okay.
My parents brought me there to see him, and of course it was mind-blowing. And then every time he was in the Boston area, once I got my driver's license, I would go to see him play.
Okay, so you got to see him a bunch.
I got to see him a bunch, and I think there's something to be said for being in the room with fantastic musicians that pales in comparison to listening to people that have been recorded, listening to recordings or watching videos. And of course, there's many musicians I never got to see because they had passed on by the time I got to the age where I wanted to hear them. But having that chance to be in the room with Buddy Rich, and then later on Tony Williams or Elvin Jones or Max Roach, and that changed my DNA. It feels like because. And I just did a drum clinic here. We're at MIM, Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix, and I just had done a drum clinic. And I talked about the value of the students hearing. I said, how many of you have ever heard me play live? Mm-hmm. And a few raised their hand, but most didn't. So I says, well, today you're going to hear me play for the first time ever.
Right.
Really, you're going to hear me, because what you've heard before is a recorded sound, a drum sound that has come through microphones or somebody's iPhone or whatever. And so you really don't know what the drums sound like when I play them and you're 10 feet away, or what my cymbals sound like, what my touch is like, what my inner balance is like, and then how I blend with you, how I blend with Manuel. So, and a lot of people don't think about that, but seeing people play, you're not hearing a drum sound, you're hearing the sound of the drums coming off the stage, you're hearing the piano, you're hearing the bass as you play it. And that's so valuable. And those kind of experiences really did influence me and change me, that I got to see and hear and witness and be in the room with those musicians. Because also the other thing is I knew what kind of effect their playing had on me. So that instructed me into what I want to emanate, what I want to put out to move the listeners that are in that audience.
So it helped give you perspective and nuance and a framework to...
How else are you going to know? Like you can listen all day to a record, but it doesn't give you that sense of what it's like to be in front of that musician and how it affects you. So now when I would go on stage, I had a lot to go on. Is like, what do I need to do to move this audience?
What would you say, like, besides, we can talk drummers, but add other musicians in there as well, besides like Buddy Rich and Tony Williams, who are obviously huge, and Elvin. Yeah. Do you remember certain things which were like light bulb moments, certain concerts, or was it just the sheer volume of stuff that you were experiencing live?
Yeah, there were, luckily, and if I go back to those years of, I started going to Berkeley in 1972. Okay. And so, and that's, I graduated high school in June 72, and then went to Berkeley in September 72. And right around that time, in a way, what I found greatly interesting about that time is I was listening to a lot of jazz that had happened not that long before, like Miles Davis with Tony Williams. Right. So that wasn't even 10 years old.
No.
That was...
In 73, they stopped in 68 or something, 69. Yeah, it was only a few years,
So it still seemed a little old to me, and from perspective of
that's
being
interesting.
a kid. Yeah,
Wow.
I know. Because I didn't see that group, with Tony Williams, and we were listening, me and a lot of the other students to like A Love Supreme, Giant Steps and stuff like that, which really wasn't that long before that. But what was happening in real time was I could go to like Boston Symphony Hall and see Weather Report. And I remember Don Romeo coming out, and he had 2 gongs, and they had, the bottoms were flat, and it's because he came out and he pounded it on the floor and and walk across the stage, and so that was happening, and I saw Miles Davis with Al Foster and Michael Henderson at Paul's Mall. The Brecker Brothers at the Jazz Workshop, Billy Cobham's group with Mike and Randy Brecker.
Dreams?
No,
was that Dreams?
It was Crosswinds.
Okay.
Billy's album called Crosswinds.
Gotcha. With a trombone player in the horn section as well.
Glenn Ferris.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And John Abercrombie on guitar.
Yes, Abercrombie, exactly.
And Milcho Lebyev on piano.
And I forget.
And there was
the bass
Alex
player.
Blake.
Alex Blake, yes,
and playing like a lot of electric. Yeah. And I was sitting in the front row with Vinnie Colaiuta, and we were screaming like girls that were watching the Beatles.
Wow.
And then, maybe a year later, Tony Williams' New Lifetime with Alan Holdsworth, Alan Pasqua, and Tony Newton. So those were these experiences were kind of mind-blowing.
Were you aware, like you and Vinny, for instance, are you similar in age?
He's 2 years younger than me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you guys aware when you made the crossover from being like screaming fangirls in the front row to like sort of beginning to dominate that scene in that world?
I don't know. That's a good question, but I don't know that there's a black and white answer to it. Sometimes when I talk to him, like we catch up every so often, it's still like we're these kids.
Yeah.
We had such a strong connection of like we shed together.
Because 72, 73 would have been a few years before he did Zappa.
Yeah, well, he didn't show up until maybe 74.
Oh, 74, okay.
74, 75.
So were you there with Stern as well? Did you meet Stern in Boston?
Yeah, that's why Stern's on the first Vital Information record.
Okay.
Yeah, we used to session together. Let's get together in session, which doesn't mean a recording session.
No, just playing.
A jam session. Just to get together and play. And so, we did a lot of that.
Was Liebman there as well around that time? No?
No, he was ahead of us.
He was ahead? Okay.
Yeah.
Did you meet Jacko around that time when he came up from Miami? Or?
I did not.
Okay.
No. I didn't meet Jocko until Vital Information opened for him at Al Rose's Italian Villa in some town in Ohio that I can't remember. But Vital Information opened for Jocko.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So those those experiences were life-changing, being in the room with those musicians, and then just slowly, in a way, it seemed like I started to work my way into. I was playing a lot of gigs in Boston and getting some good calls, but the big transition was when I auditioned for Jean-Luc Ponty and got that gig.
Right.
Then left Berkeley, and that was October 1976.
Okay.
And that was a little before, like you were saying, Vinny got with Frank Zappa.
Yeah.
Just not much, but I think that he got that gig just shortly after that.
And what was the feeling in the jazz world towards you? Like, as this guy who's obviously like got all your shit together and you're off with Jean-Luc Ponty doing this stuff, but then you go to Journey and then you come back. Was there any sort of, is that the rock guy coming over here? Or were you always the jazz guy underneath it? Was there any sort of, were you aware of any sort of like, people kind of looking sideways?
No. Well, okay, let me try to answer that. It's like I followed my opportunities.
Yep.
And I followed opportunities regardless of what they were labeled, whether they were jazz or rock or whatever,
Yeah.
And so when I got an opportunity to audition with Jean-Luc Ponty, I actually wasn't that familiar with his music. He was on one of my favorite albums, and still one of my favorite albums, which is Visions of the Emerald Beyond.
Oh shit! Okay.
The Mahavishnu Orchestra album that really features Narada Michael Walden.
Yeah.
And that album kind of was mind blower for me. I mean, if you've ever listened to that, the mix of the drums, Ken Scott's mix, like the drums are in your face, and Narada is like so killing on that. And like he's a good friend of mine too,
right.
so of course he knows that. And that even was in a way like a blueprint for playing with Journey. Okay. It's like this massive kind of rock fusion funk sound that that could work in that kind of environment of Journey, because you know you could hear Narada play with Jeff Beck, you know, and with this kind of big rock, and he played with like, and I know it's an album that Alan Holdsworth didn't like, but Velvet Darkness.
Oh yeah, wow! So
with Alfonso Johnson and Alan Pasquale. It's kind of, you know, it's really kind of rough around the edges, but it's kind of wicked.
Yeah, totally.
And so anyway, I was, you know, playing with Ponte. It was also the bass player was Ralph Armstrong. Okay. From Mahavishnu. But I didn't, and I knew Jean-Luc had records out, and of course, so when I went to the audition, I didn't know any of the music, but that didn't matter, because he had just made a new record called Imaginary Voyage.
Okay.
And he, you know, put the music in front of me. So it
was a reading audition.
Yeah, and I sight read it.
Yes.
No mistake. So I mean, my sight reading was up.
Yeah.
And it's not like that now. But
thanks to the Kenton years?
Yeah, just big band. I was like working a lot around Boston, reading music all the time.
Nice.
You know, when you do that, your chops are up.
It's one of the questions I get the most, like, hey, is it really important to read music? I say you have instant access to music that you would otherwise not have been able to access. That's always my take on it. So what's your take on?
Yeah, it's that you are able to play music that you've never heard before the first time.
Okay, yeah, okay.
That's even like boom. It's like you don't need to learn this from a demo, because I can look at the page and play it.
Right.
And Ponte, I think there was about 7 or 8 drummers at the audition, and none of the other drummers could read or really read.
Okay.
And he needed somebody that could learn music real quickly. So I read the charts, and he had me playing 7, he had me playing 5. And the audition was Jeff Berlin and Ponte and me. It was just trio with bass. And then but a lot of duets with Jean-Luc. And that night he called me and said, you know, if you want, we want
once
you in the
again,
band.
no time between the audition and the gig.
Pack your bags, you're coming to LA.
That's
so
amazing.
I did do that. But then after, you know, we talked about this in the band for a minute. It's like, then after about a year with Ponte, he wanted to make a change. So I ended up moving to LA from Boston to like get into the music world. And
I love this story, because I've never heard this
my
before.
Roommate,
the split in the road.
Right. My roommate, Chase Williams, was the road manager for Ponte, and he also worked for Freddie Hubbard. Michael Davenport was Jean-Luc Ponte's manager. He was also Freddie Hubbard's manager. So he got my foot in the door for an audition for Freddie Hubbard, which I did. And it was fantastic, and it was exciting, and Freddie liked my playing and asked me to be in the band.
Right.
Also that week, though, I had scheduled an audition with Ronnie Montrose. And Ronnie Montrose lived in the Bay Area, so I flew up to San Francisco. He was managed by Bill Graham, and he was doing a project called Open Fire. So he had put out an album of instrumental music, in roughly like a Jeff Beck kind of a thing, and he wanted a fusion drummer to play that music. And I auditioned for him, and he said, you know, you got the gig if you want to do it. So that was like, all right. And so I had just played with Ponte, who had asked me, like, if you find this, there's a video of Soundstage. The second gig I ever did with Ponte was a TV show called Soundstage, and you can still find that on YouTube. But in that video, I had this funky Gretsch kit, like, that doesn't match. None of the drums match, you know, because I had a little jazz kit and a sort of fusion kit, and I put them together. But after the first couple of months, he said, "Can you buy a Billy Cobham kit?" So, meaning 2 bass drums, you know, 3 rack drums, floor toms.
And you've never looked back.
Yeah, so I went and got my first Sonar kit. I bought that in January '77. And I was having fun playing on the big, like we were playing theaters, lights, PA. You know, it was kind of like we were rocking it. And with Ronnie Montrose, it would be that.
Right.
And with Freddie Hubbard, my sense was that it'll be clubs, it'll be back to the 18-inch Gretsch bass drum, which now I do it in a minute.
Exactly.
But then I was like 23-year-old, is like, no, I'm having too much fun with the double bass and rocking out. So, you know, I said, I'm going to go with Ronnie Montrose. And then we ended up being the opening act for Journey for a 3-month tour with Van Halen as the opening act, like a 30-minute.
One of three. Yeah. You were 2 of 3.
And then Journey was the first headline tour, and was Steve Perry's first tour with Journey, and that was 1978. And it was the Infinity Tour. So
you talk about being in the room with Buddy Rich and Tony Williams, Elvin Jones, and getting that, like, this is what the drums sound from 10 feet away and 20 feet away. What were the moments where you were in the room with a larger act to help you when you got on those bigger stages with Journey? Or was Journey the beginning of just understanding those really big rooms, arenas and stadiums?
I had seen some rock bands early. I saw Led Zeppelin, and when they put out Led Zeppelin 3, they played at Boston Garden, and I went and saw that. But that was like, and I saw Kiss, because I knew it would be a spectacle. You know, so, but you know, but I wasn't going to a lot of rock shows. I was mainly like into the jazz thing, but it was actually, in a way, playing with Ponte that I really learned how to get that big sound, because he so demanded that. And he was coming right out of the Mahavishnu.
And you said you were already playing pretty big theaters by that point.
Yeah, it was like 1,500 seat, 2,000. You know, and Ralph Armstrong was always in my ear about, you know, playing a big fat groove. And so I think, you know, I had the beginnings of it. But the finishing school of it was being in Journey. And so, and again, one of the things like a lot of people may find surprising, but when I was offered to be in Journey, that came pretty quickly too. So that was August of 1978. So, you know, I'd done that bunch of touring with Ronnie Montrose that year. But the guys in the band decided they wanted to make a change and have me in the band, and that sounded interesting to me. It wasn't like this big raise and pay, because like the money, it wasn't really there, and they were about $1 million in debt to Columbia, because they had 3 records that hadn't sold well. Then they had just recorded a 4th record that, you know, wasn't a big hit yet. It did. So it was assuming debt. It was making like $350 a week. I think I made $400 a week with Ronnie Montrose and Ponte.
Wow.
You know, that's what's normal pay.
So you took a pay cut.
Took a little pay cut, but it seemed fascinating because I thought everyone in the band played great. I thought Steve Perry sounded amazing. And I hadn't really worked with pro singers. So think about, like, I'm a, you know, Berkeley guy playing, and if I play a gig at the Holiday Inn for a week, it's like the sax player might be the singer.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I had never really worked with a pro singer. So you know, Perry took me to school on that, and he was a drummer, and then a singing drummer, and then a frontman without drums. So he would always have a lot of input, and I was just open to it, you know, and so he helped me develop a kind of playing approach that gave him the support that he needed so he could be free. And being a musician with a lot of training and technique and chops, and I could just adapt myself to it. It wasn't a stretch. It was relatively easy once I knew what the gig required. You know, I'm a quick study in figuring out what does the gig need.
Sure.
And then I'll just.
I see that in your own band. Like, since it's been me and Manuel, it's different from what it was in the previous iterations or previous iterations.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that you had to adapt to that situation somewhat. You know what I mean? Like, is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, because
it's not like you're just, I'm Steve and I'm the band leader and you follow me. It feels very much more like a collective. That's what I said in a recent episode of the podcast, as I was I did an episode in the middle of the tour and said, hey, what's great about this gig is it's not my band, it's not my gig, it's not my name on the marquee, but I still feel like almost a band leader in terms of the input that all three of us have as a collective. Very nice sideman situation to be in for me.
Yeah, and the way that I run Vital Information is that it is like a collective. I'm a good collaborator.
Right, yeah. 100%.
And so I'm not a band leader that like, here are the charts, guys. You know, let's play this.
Yeah.
You know, it's like let's make music together.
Yeah, and
that's always been the way. I'm not capable of writing 10 songs and but I can co-write, I can collaborate, I can conceptualize, I can be a partner in that. And I need
what a lot of this album is. Which is what a lot of this album ended up being,
Yeah. And I like that process. I like to collaborate and work together, and then have the people in the band feel part of it, the creative process,
which
contribute.
I absolutely do, and obviously Manuel, I'm sure, does.
Yeah.
And we are, for everyone watching and listening here, we are on such an unbelievable time crunch. We could sit here and talk another 2 hours, but we do actually have to go play a show, and we've already done sound check. Steve gave a clinic for 90 minutes. We just had dinner. It's like been one of those days, and it's the last day of the tour. But before we do end, the new album is Time Flies. It's a double album, kind of thanks to involving George.
It wasn't intended to be.
It was not intended.
Yeah.
Even though you blocked 6 days in the studio, we ended up kind of cutting a second record in one afternoon.
That's right. Yeah, we had 10 songs prepared.
Right.
And we went in with the intention of recording all 10 songs. And just to go through it, like the first day, is like kind of this hugely extended drum tuning day, because I hadn't changed my drum heads like 10 years. So we went into the studio, my tech, Chris, and I, we just took all the heads off, like tuned it up, got it going. And then Manuel had a couple of pieces that he had programmed into a
demos,
computer. Yeah. So I just figured I'm going to play along with them because they're really good, and I like that process. I wasn't going to do the whole record like that, but I did. So that day I got the drum sound, and then I played 2 tracks to the computer, so you could do your part to that. And
so me and Manuel show up day 2, and like a fifth of the record is already done, and all we have to do is overdub our parts on 2 songs.
But then we did play everything.
We did play everything.
We played everything live after that. And so when I was at Berkeley, 72, 73, 74, George Garzone was also at Berkeley.
Right.
And George still has this band called The Fringe, and The Fringe was around then. Slightly different lineup. It was Richie Appleman, who was the head of the bass department, was on bass. And Bob Galati was the drummer.
Yeah.
And in those days, I don't remember what gig it was, but Bob Galati went on some extended tour, and Rich Appleman and George said, you want to play in the Fringe. So that was another one of those, that was a very cool experience, because that was all about, in a way, transcending time and space and playing music that would just levitate you. And there was a little bit of music, but mostly like improvising and just kind of going for it. And we'd play gigs, and it would be like taking people on an acid trip or something. So, and then I also worked with George in a group called Baird Hersey and the Year of the Ear.
Okay.
I also played with them in the Golden Chords, which was a wedding band.
You and Garzone in a wedding band. That's
and we would just play, like Girl Promephany. It wasn't like the wedding bands of today, when they know all these pop hits. Like the old-fashioned wedding, So anyway, so I guess what the long story I'm getting to is Baird Hersey, this band leader, called me to play on his record 2 years ago. It was a new album. And then he called George to play on it. So it got me thinking about George. Also, I heard Peter's album with George, the 3 Nights in L.A.
Yeah.
Kind of blew my mind.
Smoking, really.
How great that record is. Yeah. So I need to get George's number again. And so we invited George to come and play on Inception.
Right, just on one tune.
Yeah. And then that led to...
what is this thing called Love?
Well, that first, then it was like, I had this idea, let's play something that maybe we can put in front of Tempest Fuga, halftime funk.
Yep.
So we did that, and we just improvised 3-4 minutes.
Yeah.
And it was like, wow, that's great. And then George wanted to do a duet with drums. And so we played 2 choruses of What Is This Thing Called Love? And then we edited it onto the beginning of a take we had already done.
Yep.
And then he had this idea, let's play one down, one up.
The Coltrane thing.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
We went in.
Because he had been working on it. I love that about him. It's I've been working on this for the last couple of months. Let's play it, yeah.
So we played it one take, and it was killing. And then he said this phrase, like, let's just play like we're offering a prayer.
Right. That was, remember when we did that kind of ballad thing?
Yeah.
That was right after he said that. That might be my favorite track on it because it was completely improvised and it sounds like Klaus Ogerman wrote it or something. I mean, it sounds so
amazing,
compositionally, you know.
And then you started a lot of stuff with the sounds or with the
pedals.
bass line.
Yeah, sure.
So we
got a double album out of it.
Yeah, and so by the time we were done, like 3 hours later, we still weren't sure.
Yeah.
But all this music was there. And then when I mixed the record, I mixed Time Flies, the 10 songs. Yeah. And then I said to Costa, the engineer, let's just mix what we did with George. And we were done. It was like, that's another album.
Whole other record.
That's a whole album. Yeah. But it made sense to package it with it. So it's just a double CD that.
Right. Which is coming out May 5th. Yeah. May 5th. So this podcast will be out shortly before that. Which also means this podcast will be out with about 6 weeks to buy tickets for the East Coast tour. We're here in Phoenix, Arizona, finishing the West Coast leg. We start out in Long Island at the Long Island Drum Center, June 17th, and we finish up with 3 nights at Birdland in Manhattan, which finishes the 2nd.
I think it's June 30th and July 1st and 2nd.
1st and 2nd, yeah. And in between is Rochester and Cleveland and Blues Alley and a whole bunch of days there. All on
your website?
Or on everyone's website.
Yeah, vitalinformation.com.
And janekgwizdala.com. And I will also link them below in the description of this video if you're watching on YouTube. I'll also put them in the show notes of the podcast if you're just listening. Steve, you're the man. I hope this is part 1 of many.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it.